their day. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. We're really excited to have you on today as we talk about habitat improvements for Vermont's black bears. We have Jackie Comeau, who's the bear biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, joining us to kind of talk us through this whole process and letting us think about habitat for for bears in particular, but wildlife. And so thanks for joining us. We're really glad to bring you these programs. And if you like them and you want to support them, please visit our website. I'll drop that in the chat. And you can hit the donate button there and let us know that this is something you like and you want to continue, us to continue. In addition, we will have the chat box going, so everybody should be muted so we don't have background noise. If you have any questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box, and I'll be asking those to Jackie at the end, and we'll see what kind of answers we can generate from there. So let me do a quick intro of Jackie, and then I'll turn it over. So Jackie has done her studied wildlife ecology at University of Maine and the University of New Hampshire. And for her master's, she focused on techniques to address human-bear conflicts. She'd worked on a variety of carnivore research projects across North America before coming to work for Vermont Fish and Wildlife in 2014. And she's our black bear biologist for the state. And before that, she helped assist landowners on managing their lands for wildlife. So go ahead, Jackie, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Let me just share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Did that come through? All right.
Yes, all looks good.
All right, great. All right, so like Lisa said, I'm going to be talking about creating habitat for bears today. And so real quick, just for a little context, as Lisa said, I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and our mission is the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. So this is a pretty broad mission. We're focused on conservation initiatives for the needs of individual species, all the way up to the needs of an entire ecosystems. And we're thinking about habitat and habitat management at the landscape scale across the entire state, all the way down to issues on individual woodlots. And so when we're thinking about habitat for bears, I think it's first helpful to define what is habitat. And habitat is the food, water, space, and cover or shelter that an animal needs to survive and successfully reproduce. So I'm going to be talking about all of these components as they relate to the needs of bears. But really, probably the most important habitat component when thinking about bears is understanding their diet, understanding those food needs that they have. And so here in Vermont, bears have a very diverse diet. They're what we call an opportunistic omnivore. So they eat a lot of different foods, and they're very flexible in what foods they want to rely on. But for the most part in Vermont, plants make up the bulk of a bear's diet. And that might be anything from eating vegetation directly, like grasses, sedges, leaves. But more importantly, it's actually the fruits that plants produce that bears rely on. And those fruits can be put into two general categories. One is called soft mast. So those are fruits that are soft and fleshy. So things like apples, blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, cherries, and mountain ash, just to name a few. And then the other category is what we call hard mast. So those are fruits that are covered with a hard shell. So common ones in Vermont are acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts, hazelnuts, and even seeds. And then, of course, insects also make up a big bulk of a bear's diet. And then they will opportunistically eat meat, most commonly by feeding on newborn moose calves and deer fawns. And that's really only a narrow window in the early spring when those animals are unable to outrun a bear. But very quickly, they grow big enough and fast enough that bears can't catch them anymore. And they will opportunistically predate on eggs and nestling birds. So all of those plants that bears rely on have their own habitat needs. And so there are specific types of forests and features on the landscape that those plants need to grow. And so bears are having to navigate the landscape to find the habitats that support those plants that they need. So wetlands are a really important habitat feature bears are looking for. Wetlands tend to support unique plants, a lot of the herbaceous plants that bears like to eat, but then also a lot of those soft mass producing shrubs that bears rely on. Bears also are seeking out what we call young forest habitats. So these are areas where the tree canopy has been removed, either through some sort of natural disaster or human alterations to the landscape. So things like power lines or areas of recent logging. And so young forest habitats are those where full sun is reaching the forest floor. And so it's allowing plants that need those full sun conditions to thrive. And again, a lot of these plants produce that soft mass that bears are looking for. So again, things like blueberries, cherries, raspberries, blackberries. And then of course, mature forests are really important for blackberries as well. It's in those mature forests where bears can find the hard mass they're looking for. So mature oak trees, beech trees, hickory trees, but then also mature forests tend to have a lot of standing dead trees that we call snags or downwoody debris that support a lot of the insects that bears need. And I'll just take a moment to really talk specifically about the importance of beech trees for bears. Where beech nuts are a food option for bears in the fall, research has shown it's actually their preferred fall food. And so even though beech nuts are a lot smaller than acorns, they are higher content of protein and they're just a more calorically dense or calorically rich food compared to acorns. So bears do prefer them. And beech trees, unfortunately, don't produce big nut crops every year. They tend to cycle and produce a good crop every other year. Bears also reproduce every other year. So a female bear usually only gives birth to cubs every other winter. And research has shown that where beech nuts are an important food for bears, female bears will actually synchronize their reproduction with beech nut cycles. So they are more likely to give birth to cubs in a winter following a good beech nut cycle. And so here's an example of that in action. This is a map showing data we collected from a GPS collared female bear in a study we were doing in southern Vermont. So if you can see my cursor over here on the right-hand side, this is Brattleboro, Vermont. This heavy yellow line running east-west through the middle of this Route 9. And then over here on the left-hand side is Bennington. At the top of the screen is Stratton Mountain. And then we've got Somerset Reservoir, Mount Snow, and then Harriman Reservoir down here, just to get you oriented. The blue rectangle is outlining what we consider the core home range of this female bear. And those yellow circles are her movements collected by the GPS collar. And so in the fall of 2019, we saw a good beech nut crop. There were plenty of beech trees in her home range, but for whatever reason, she chose to leave her home range and started moving north. She paused here briefly in a beech concentration, but then decided to keep moving north, traveling through the Glastonbury and Liebrook wilderness areas in the Green Mountain National Forest, before ultimately making it over here to the southern part of Stratton Mountain, where she spent about a week and a half in some beech concentrations there. And then eventually she's just started heading south again, where she re-entered her kind of core home range to den for the winter. And now if we look at the movements of that same bear, the previous fall in 2018, we actually saw really poor beech nut production that year. And so again, we're now kind of shifting our view south. So here's her core home range again, outlined in blue. You can still kind of make out Harriman Reservoir over here. And now right below that blue rectangle, that's actually the Vermont, Massachusetts state line. And this year, when beech nut production was really poor, she headed south. She entered northwestern Massachusetts, where the forests are much more dominated by oak. But unfortunately, in that part of Massachusetts, acorn production was also really poor that fall. So she kept heading south all the way to southwestern Massachusetts, where she finally found productive oak trees. And she spent about a month down there feeding on acorns before turning around again and heading back up to her poor home range. And she actually had 1 to 2 cubs of the year traveling with her during that big movement. So this is kind of an extreme example. Bears don't always make such long distance movements every fall to find food. Sometimes they can find the foods they need right in their home range, or they might shift to a forest adjacent to their home range to find the foods they need. But I think this is important to highlight, to understand that space is a really big component of a bear's habitat needs. And they need vast amounts of space to find the foods that they need from year to year to survive. So when we're thinking about bear habitat conservation and management, we really need to be thinking about what we call landscape connectivity, and having a connected landscape where bears can safely move around to find the foods they need. All right, and then the other thing I want to talk about is cover. And when cover becomes most important for bears, it's during the winter when they enter a den to kind of ride out that food shortage that happens during the winter. And so this video that's playing on loop is a collared bear from that same study. And you can see she was actually denning inside this kind of monster yellow birch cavity tree in the Green Mountain National Forest. So cavity trees like this provide really great shelter for bears during the winter. It keeps them out of the wind and the snow and the rain. This bear actually had 3 cubs of the year inside that den. So it was a really great safe place for her to give birth and nurse those newborn cubs. And then here's another cavity tree. This is a big yellow or red maple cavity tree. And that bear inside is a 3-year-old male bear. This is a much lower profile cavity tree. You could walk right by this in the woods and not think twice about it. Bears can kind of be like mice when it comes to picking a winter den. If their head can fit, they'll get the rest of their body in there too somehow. And cavity trees aren't the only thing bears need, or the only type of structure they'll use to den in. They'll den under blown down trees. They will den in brush piles, rock piles, all sorts of different things. All right, so that's kind of a big overview of habitat features bears are looking for. So now we can kind of think about, well, what can you do on your own woodlots to help improve the habitat for bears? So the first thing you can think about is considerations to improve mass production in your forest. And there are kind of 2 timber harvest techniques that are really useful for this. One is called a mass tree release, and the other is creating young forest habitat through patch cut. And I'll talk specifically about each of those in a moment. You can also look at ways to increase down woody debris in your forest. So that means just increase the number of trees or logs that are on the forest floor. So again, remember, these as they rot become great reservoirs for the insects bears need, and they also create the potential cover bears need for denning in the winter. Retaining snags. Again, snag is a word we use when describing a standing dead tree. So retaining snags and cavity trees. So those trees that may still be alive, but have holes inside their trunk that bears can use to den in. Again, these are a good reservoir for insects and also protective cover for winter den sites. And if you're interested in doing any of this, before I get into more detail on it, it's also really important to consider talking with a professional. So if you aren't working with a consulting forester, it might be worth reaching out to one, or at the very least, reaching out to your county forester, and let them know that habitat management is one of your top priorities for your land. And they can certainly, help guide you in these efforts and kind of point out the appropriate places to implement projects like this. And then, of course, we also have staff who work with private landowners to help guide and give advice for these types of projects. All right, so first we'll talk about the mass tree release cuts. And so what this means is basically, I use the word release, and what we're talking about is we're releasing the desired mass tree from competition. So we're kind of removing its direct competition and giving it more space and resources to grow. So the first step is looking for mass trees on your property. Do you have important mass trees growing on your property for bears? So things like oak, beech, hickory, black cherry, apple. These are just a few. There are some others, but these are kind of the big key ones that we think about. So once you've found that, yes, I do have these trees growing on my property. That check mark's a little off, sorry about that. You want to select the healthy and dominant and co-dominant mass trees. And so this top figure kind of highlights how that works. You can see some of these trees are labeled with a D and some are labeled with a CD. That's dominant and co-dominant. So you're looking for those healthy trees that are kind of already growing up in the canopy. So they've already kind of reached maturity or a mature enough level where they can be producing mast. And then after you've selected the dominant trees, you want to then release them on 3 to 4 sides. And this bottom figure kind of shows what that looks like. So this is kind of looking from a bird's eye view down at the crowns of the trees in your forest. And this green tree has been the selected mass tree that you want to release. So you're going to cut out all those other trees growing around it. So you're giving that tree's canopy or crown more space to grow. And so giving it more, the ability to collect more sunlight, more resources, and produce more mast. And then you also, if you do have beech trees on your property, you do need to kind of use a lighter touch for them. Beech have a really thin bark compared to other trees, and they were evolved to grow in a more mature forest. So that thin bark is actually really sensitive to too much sunlight. And so if you get too much sunlight on that trunk, it can actually kill the beech tree. So instead of releasing on 3 or 4 sides, you really only want to cut away trees on 2 to 3 sides and not the south side. Because in the winter, when leaf off happens, that south side will get way too much sunlight. So you want another tree there to kind of shade that southern side of the tree. All right, here are a couple pictures showing examples of what this work looks like. On the left is an oak tree. And you can kind of see from the background what the conditions were like around this oak tree before the cut happened. A bunch of pole-sized trees and then a lot of smaller trees kind of all competing in this small space. And so in this situation, they just cut out the pole trees and the smaller trees that were growing up tight to this oak tree to give it more space. And I'll also point out, notice that they left all of the trees they cut on the floor or on the forest floor underneath this oak tree. And then the picture on the right is a hickory. And so this kind of gives you the perspective of what it would look like looking up to the crown of that tree. And so you can see now it has all this space around its crown and will allow it to kind of grow quickly and fill in that space and just increase how its growth and decrease the amount of time it's going to take until it reaches kind of peak mast production. And now here's an example of this technique applied to an old apple orchard. So these apple trees have been overgrown by all of these pasture pines growing around them. And so in this situation, the landowner worked with their consulting forester to cut out a lot of the pasture pine and give these apple trees the full sun conditions that they need. And you can notice here, they left some snags in the background when appropriate. They created these nice brush piles and left down woody debris within the apple orchard, again, to help bears and other wildlife as well. All right, and then the other technique for increasing mass production is a patch cut to create that young forest habitat. And so here's an example of what this can look like. To be successful with this, you really want to remove at least 90% of the canopy, and you want to apply this to at least 2 acres. If you do it less than 2 acres, you're not going to create enough of that full sun condition that those young forest plant species really need. So if you want a lot of blackberries and raspberries and things like that to come back, going over 2 acres is usually recommended. The other thing we really recommend if you're doing a patch cut is to leave at least 4 logs per acre that you cut on the forest floor, and to try to leave at least 4 snags per acre. This is kind of an extreme example. This is what we call a chop and drop, where the landowner decided to just leave all the trees that they cut on site. And this is partially because this landowner's goal was 100% wildlife habitat, and is also like a really remote site where access was an issue. And the quality of the trees they were cutting had very little market value. So it just logistically would have been too challenging to pull the wood out as well. But you can implement cuts like this in a commercial setting where you as the landowner can generate money from doing the cut, but also do it in a way that actually is beneficial to wildlife like bears. And so again, thinking about leaving as many logs on the forest floor as you can, leaving as much slash or tops from those trees on the forest floor, leaving snags or cavity trees. You can kind of see this big wolfy pine on the right-hand side of the picture. It's a little hard to make out, but you can see these cut lines. They actually girdled this tree, meaning they cut shallow rings through its bark all the way around the tree, and this will kill the tree. So it'll create a future snag for wildlife to utilize. And then here are a couple of pictures of bears using these types of cuts that landowners have shared with us. So, a bear taking advantage of an old apple orchard that had been released, and then a bear cruising along the edge of a patch cut that was done for wildlife habitat. And so why is managing habitat important for bears and Vermont's wildlife as a whole? Well, we at Fish and Wildlife really think about the black bear as an umbrella species. And this means that because we know bears need access to different wetland types to find the foods they need, we know bears also need access to young forest habitat to find the foods they need, and access to mature forests. And as I pointed out, they also need to be able to safely navigate the landscape to find these different habitat features. So we know if we have a healthy bear population, it means we're doing a good job providing these different types of habitats and a connected landscape. And of course, these habitats support a wide variety of other wildlife species, not just bears. So if we're doing a good job conserving our bear population, it means we're doing at least some good things to help benefit a lot of Vermont's other wildlife. All right, and while I have your attention, I'm going to also talk about backyard habitat management as it benefits bears. So bears do love all those wild natural foods, but they will kind of slum it and come into our backyards occasionally too. And so there are steps that we can take to help prevent this from happening, which really do help keep our bears safe. So why are bears coming into our backyards to look for human foods instead of their wild natural foods? Well, a big reason can often be just a lack of natural foods. So all those different plants we've been talking about, some of them can be cyclical in nature. Some of them are only producing mass during very short periods of the year. And some of them are very susceptible to weather and environmental factors. So we may just have conditions where one year, the whole blackberry crop just fails, or the apple crop may fail, or like I said, like the oak or beech nut crops may be variable. And so when those situations happen, there are other foods that bears can rely on, but they're usually not as valuable. And so they may turn to kind of higher caloric foods in our backyards instead. Bears also just have an innate curiosity to discover and find new foods. So that can also contribute to why they come to our backyards. And if they're able to repeatedly find foods in our backyards, these experiences over time can start leading to what we call habituation or food conditioning. Research has shown that your average bear understands there's risks coming into our backyards, and they will choose to forage for wild foods over human foods if they can. But if they get into your bird feeder enough times where they realize, wow, this is actually a pretty good food source, nothing bad happens to me when I do this, they may start to change that behavior and start relying on our backyards as a more regular part of their diet. And so what are the things that are attracting bears into our backyards? Well, the common attractants are birdseed, garbage, compost, chickens, and beehives. And I'm going to talk about each of these briefly. But first, I just want to point out why this is such a concern to us. Again, just like why is it important to manage habitat for bears, there's also a reason why it's important for us to keep bears out of our backyards. The map on the left here is a little outdated. It just shows reported human bear incidents from 2016 to 2019. But those red and blue towns are kind of the parts of the state where we tend to get the most reports. So this just kind of gives you a sense of the distribution of human bear incidents happening across the state. And then the figure here shows the number of reports we've received annually from 2011 through 2021. And what we're finding is that these human bear incidents are increasing. On average, for the past 6 years, we've been receiving about 750 reports a year, whereas the previous 6 years, we were only receiving like 230 reports a year. So we're seeing a big increase. And sadly, we're also seeing an increase in the number of bears incidentally killed in Vermont. So we've been seeing on average a little over 160 bears killed each year. Most of these bears are dying by being hit by vehicles on our roads. But some of them every year are dying directly in conflict situations with people. And, the ones being hit on the roads may not all be related to bears feeding in backyards, but we do know that, bears who are relying regularly on backyards are going to encounter roads more frequently. So it makes them more vulnerable to being hit by vehicles. And I think somewhat surprisingly is that our bear population estimates during the same time period show our bear population has been stable. It's been pretty stable for over 10 years now. We're not seeing more conflicts because our bear population is ballooning out of control. So I think this data to me says that we really need to step back and think like, well, what can we as individuals do to help promote coexistence between people and bears and just be better neighbors to our wildlife in general? And so that's going to kind of bring us into those common attractants I mentioned and some steps that you all can take to help keep bears safe. So we look at bird feeders as the gateway drug. And this is because, the seed that we're putting out for birds is very similar to the type of food bears are eating in the wild already. So it's a really easy transition for them to start feeding on this bird seed. And again, instead of having to forage to the forest floor, here are thousands of calories in this nice, compact, convenient container that they can just suck down in 5 minutes. And so like I mentioned earlier, every time they're getting an easy and what they think of as a safe meal in your backyard, that's creating a learning experience that's giving them an opportunity to change their behavior. And in these situations with sows with cubs, this is giving those cubs also an opportunity to learn, well, what is food? Where do I find food? So this is creating maybe like a population level change in behavior when you think about how these family units are interacting with our backyards. And so really what we really want folks to do is to just not feed birds when bears are active. Our recommendation used to be for most of the state to take down bird feeders, April 1st to December 1st. But this really isn't probably an accurate time period anymore. With climate change, we're seeing more bears are staying active later into the year, and more bears are coming out of their winter dens earlier. So we need to really be paying attention if we are feeding birds in the winter, and as winter conditions start to go away, take down your bird feeder before the bears find it. There are options for planting native plants in your backyard and landscaping for birds to help attract them instead of using a bird feeder. And I'm actually participating in a webinar next week with Vermont Audubon to talk about their Native Plants for Birds program. And we'll drop a link to that in the chat if people are interested. Of course, garbage is the other big one. Like I said, bears are opportunistic omnivores, so are people. So we have a lot of overlap in our diets, but bears have a less discerning palate than we do. And so they're not above going through our garbage can to eat our throwaways. And so really the key to keeping bears out of garbage is odor control and secure storage. You really can't just be putting your garbage in an open garbage can out, at the end of your driveway anymore. You need to have some sort of bear resistant garbage can. There's lots of manufactured options out there, but they can be expensive and hard to get. So there are also options for how you can retrofit your garbage can to make it bear resistant. And we have information about that on our website. You also should, if you can, store your garbage in some sort of secure building, like a garage or a shed or a basement or barn, some sort of structure that you can keep locked to keep wildlife out of. And then to control the odors, dispose of your garbage as frequently as you can. If you have, some really smelly food scraps, like let's say you do like a lobster bake one day and it's going to be a while before you can get to the dump, consider putting that in your freezer until you can dispose of it. And then you can use things like ammonia and mothballs to help kind of mask the enticing smells of your garbage. So maybe putting a rag soaked in ammonia, inside your garbage bag liner, things like that. Composting is becoming a bigger issue in Vermont for obvious reasons. And just like garbage, odor control and secure storage are the key. Odor control is achievable if you're following kind of the recommended composting recipe of 3 parts brown material to 1 part kitchen scraps or green materials. And we really recommend that folks invest in some sort of tumbler instead of just an open pit compost to just kind of create an extra level of barrier between wildlife and your compost. And then if you raise chickens or bees, electric fencing is a must. There's so many different reasons why bears are attracted to chickens and bees. But sadly, bears are being shot over chickens every year in Vermont. And it's a pretty preventable situation if you can take the time to invest in an electric fence and learn how to use it properly. And again, we have a lot of information on our website about this. And so that brings me to our website. The other thing, besides taking some steps to securing attractants in your backyard, we're really asking Vermonters to take the time to report their bear incidents to us. We know that the reports that come into us are just a small fraction of the number of incidents that are happening in the state. And this data is really useful to us to understand, well, where are people having the most problems with bears? What types of attractants and situations are causing these problems? And this information will help us kind of tailor our assistance program to help landowners resolve ongoing conflicts. But it's also important information so that we can better tailor the information we're sharing with Vermonters to help prevent future conflicts and just promote coexistence in general. So if you go to our website or just search for Vermont Living with Bears, it'll bring you to this website. And right at the top, there's a link where you can submit a report for any time you have a bear come into your backyard. We'd like to hear about it. We are in the process of kind of updating this reporting form. So if you submit a report today or tomorrow, it's going to be a little clunky, but please power through if you can. But within the next month, it should be a much more streamlined, easy to use version. And so, I know a lot of folks commonly will, share information about bear conflicts through local social media or front porch forum. So if you do hear about folks who are having issues in your community, we certainly ask that you, point them in our direction so that we can hear about it. And then also on our website, we have lots of information about bear-resistant garbage cans and tips you can take to help keep your garbage secure. Lots of information about composting, how to use and maintain electric fences. And then we also have information for landowners that go beyond what I've talked about today in terms of thinking about wildlife habitat when managing your property. And with that, I will kind of stop sharing my screen and we can kind of open this up to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Jackie. We do have a few questions that have been typed into the chat box, so I will start with the first one from Dave, who says, was the bear that traveled north and then south the same bear? And was the mileage round trip or one way?
So it was the same bear. Yep, she was a mature sow. I think she was 7 years old when she made the northerly trip and 6 years old during making the southern trip. And those mileages are rough round trip. I mean, it was just me kind of drawing a line, measuring it. So in reality, she traveled much farther than that. But it was just to kind of give you guys a ballpark of the scale of those movements that she was making. And I'll point out, I like to use that example because female bears tend to travel less than male bears. So I find that example, especially impressive being a female bear. And in one of those years, she had dependent cubs traveling with her.
So Caitlin wants to know if bears return to the same den each year.
That's a great question. Generally, no, they don't. I know some researchers who study bears have seen bears that will reuse a den site, or even sometimes a different bear using a site that another bear had used a few years earlier. But in general, they pick a new spot every year. And, we sometimes scratch our heads over what inspires them to choose their dens. Some have really amazing, amazing dens, like those cavity trees. They're so well protected, but then we'll sometimes see a bear where it looks like they basically just picked a spot and they'll create what we call a ground nest, where they'll just kind of scratch up some leaves and just lay down and let the snow cover them. And that's pretty much it for the winter. So really there's no shortage of denning structures for bears in our woods, but it is just a fun thing to consider when you're managing your woodlot. And those down logs and brush piles, a bear might use them, but so many other creatures will use them as well. And the same with cavity trees. A bear might one year decide to curl up in that cavity tree, but you've got raccoons and chickadees and owls and woodpeckers and all sorts of other species that really rely on those trees as well.
Well, you led right into the next question. When felling trees and leaving them on the forest floor, do bears prefer to have a few easy travel lanes cleared here and there, or do they just leave, should you just leave it jumbled and let them figure it out?
Yeah, just leave it jumbled, let them figure it out. We had one in that study area where we're doing that study in southern Vermont. A lot of that was done in the Green Mountain National Forest. And in one of the wilderness areas, there's actually a microburst that had gone through right in the early years of the study. And oh my goodness, all the trees were knocked down, all different directions. I mean, we're talking blowdowns taller than our heads. And yeah, we would have bears den in there every few years. And it was not fun to get through, but they were fine, just kind of scrambling through and finding a good spot to lay down. So they don't mind a challenge.
Kathy wants to know, how much do bears eat daily? They're so large, it seems like they need a lot of food to maintain their weight.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I would guess, there are some folks who have done studies with like captive bears to like monitor what is their daily caloric intake. But a lot of it just depends on what foods they're eating. The one thing I can say is that during the fall, they do enter this altered physiological state that we call hyperphagia, which is kind of just a fancy word for meaning they become eating machines. And in preparation for the winter food shortage, when they're going to be entering dens, they are basically forgoing sleep and eating as much as they can. But again, I don't have a hard number on like what that means in terms of volume or calories.
Great. We have a habitat management question. Is whole tree harvesting land bad for bears?
Oh, gosh, not necessarily, because again, it can support like a lot of plant life coming back that provides good food sources for bears. I would say from a habitat perspective overall, if you can encourage the loggers to leave some material behind, that is better for wildlife as a whole. Again, any slash that can be left, selecting maybe at least, like I said, roughly 4 logs per acre if possible. And I know logistically that can become cumbersome for the loggers based on the equipment they're using. But if it's possible, I think it's worth trying to do, because again, any of that downwoody debris, it is helpful for bears and other wildlife.
Great. I'm sure there's a few more questions out there, so go ahead and type them in the chat box. I will note that one of our people on the call note that they've been putting their garbage in their bulkhead, which is concrete and steel, instead of putting it out, and they've been just putting it out in the bins that morning when the garbage truck comes. But they say they can see the bear claws where they could smell the garbage, but they couldn't get to it. So there's an interesting place to store your garbage. They say they still come after the compost bins, and they're going to start electrifying them this summer. So some good advice there, and people taking it to heart and implementing it.
Great. Yeah, that's great to hear. And I would say for that bulkhead situation, that could be a situation where you maybe, soak a rag in ammonia to put on the inside edge of that bulkhead, and maybe that smell will be enough to deter them from scratching, on your doors.
Yeah, I've heard they can smell like miles. Like, what is that? Is there actually a number? Has anybody done any research on that?
Yeah, I haven't read the research directly, but that is kind of the number that's out there, is that they, their sense of smell is their strongest sense. And that's really how they're perceiving the world around them, is through their nose. And yeah, supposedly they can smell for, over a mile away. I think what I think about too with that is like that sense of smell coupled with that learned experience of where to find food. I think those both are playing in. And so that's another component to all of this in terms of dealing with attractants in your backyard, is if you're dealing with a bear who has already had a lot of experience getting into garbage or bird feeders or compost, that's going to be a much harder situation to resolve. Whereas if we can get to a point where we're already implementing these steps before the bear learns to find food there, I think it's going to be less inclined to follow its nose into your backyard. It's going to be less inclined to like dig at your bulkhead doors if it's never gotten garbage before. So that's, it's another thing to think about. I think, a lot of times we kind of get relaxed on our behaviors and then remind ourselves once the bear actually shows up and gets into our attractants, like, oh, right, I got to be a little bit better about this. But every time we do that, it also gives the bears a chance to kind of up their game and get more persistent about backyard foods.
Great. Jack, you said the bear population has been stable for the last 10 years. What are the numbers are we looking at in, statewide?
Yeah, so right now we do only conduct a population estimate statewide. So we don't have like regionally specific numbers. So again, when I say it's stable, there are probably parts of the state where the population is increasing and maybe other parts where it's decreasing. There is fluctuation that happens year to year, but on average, we're estimating around 4,500 to 5,500 bears most years. Again, with maybe a 500 to 1,000 bears, give or take, range on that. Yeah, and again, like I said, we've been using the same type of data and similar methods, since the 70s now. So we do have a good feel for, our numbers the exact number may not be exact, but the trends are pretty trustworthy. And so we do feel like, yeah, it's been stable for a while, around, like I said, 45 to 5,500 bears.
Great. Caitlin says that she understands that bears going to kind of wake up, they're not deep hibernators, and that they will wake up during the winter. Do they leave their dens during warm spells like a January thaw, or do they just wake up, rouse a little, but stay put?
Yeah, it depends on the bear. Sows with cubs, especially sows that have just given birth to cubs, they're giving birth in January or February. They're not getting up until, like, even that video of that sow climbing that big yellow birch cavity tree, that was mid-April, and she was coming out every day to eat snow, we think, to just help with her hydration for lactation. But she's pretty much stuck to that den site until those little cubs are strong enough to start moving across the landscape with her. Male bears, younger bears, females that aren't reproducing yet, they're much more flexible. And so we will see some bears will come up or come out and start walking around. They can travel decent distances from their den. And so if you do hear in your neighborhood of a bear getting into someone's bird feeder, it's good for everyone to just take down their feeders for a week or two, because it's really food that drives these bears to be in a den in the winter. And if conditions are warm enough, there's not a lot of snow, and they can start regularly finding good food sources, they will stay active.
Do we, you mentioned climate change affecting when we're putting feeders in and out. Are there other concerns with climate change with bear, and what might those be?
Well, one just kind of general unknown is, again, their diet is so tied to the productivity of all of these plants. And so as, climate conditions become more variable, less predictable, those could have implications for the plants that support bears. So, like our acorn production, beech nut production, but again, soft mast, especially, like a lot of our blackberry and raspberries are much more finicky about cold temperatures and how much rain they get in terms of what they're going to have for berry production. So there's that whole uncertainty in terms of how productive their foods are going to remain in the face of climate change. And then again, this whole denning behavior, and seeing bears kind of coming out earlier in March or going into their dens later in the fall and winter. And we're seeing bears coming out in mid-March, but green up still isn't happening until usually like mid-April. And so knowing what these bears are going to do, are they just going to go back into a den if they can't find food, or are they going to stay on the landscape and just start burning calories, even though there aren't a lot of natural food calories to kind of replenish them? So that's kind of an unknown as well.
So I know we had the study going on for the wind influence of the towers down south. Is that completed, and what did we learn?
Yeah, so we wrapped up data collection last spring, and we are like inundated. We've got so much data. It's awesome, but we're still kind of plugging away on the analysis side of it at this point. So we're hoping like by the end of this year, early next year, we'll start putting out reports And we'll definitely be doing a lot of presentations and outreach about what we learned. But we're really hoping to better understand how energy development in some of those bear scarred beach concentrations impacts bear use of that food source. But then on top of that, we're really hoping to also use this data to better explore our understanding of what bears need for landscape connectivity and their ability to kind of safely navigate things like, especially roads. So yeah, it's to be determined, but we certainly will start sharing that data once we have a better handle on it.
That's awesome, because I know with so many people, whether they be climate refugees or COVID refugees or whatever, we have a lot of influx into the state and houses being built and reducing that connectivity. And so having a handle on that will be great. So I'm really excited you guys are looking into that. Are there any more bears that are collared, or is that just sort of done and we're doing analysis and we're not doing any more collaring at the moment?
Yeah, we're kind of taking a break from collaring right now while we get that wrapped up. We do have additional funding sources right now. That as a department, we're kind of creating a list of priorities in terms of what we all need to better understand for our conservation efforts. And so, collaring more bears to understand like reproduction and survival of cubs is on our priority list, but we have a long wish list, so I'm not sure if that will happen or not, but it's one thing we are considering right now.
Don't we all have that long wish list? I know we have it with Vermont Coverage, so it's good to hear everybody has it as well. One of our listeners, I don't know, listeners, watchers, wants to know if you can talk about the role that seeps play for bear in early spring.
Oh yes, seeps are a great spot for bears. So again, seeps are, for anyone who's not familiar, are these kind of naturally wet areas. They're usually pretty small in scale, but they tend to have, vegetation come up early there. And it's a lot of good like sedges and things that bears do like to eat. So yeah, we'll certainly see if you're kind of just cruising through the woods, especially in early spring, you'll notice where some of those sedges have been browsed by not just bear, deer as well. But it's really when those grasses and sedges and different herbaceous plants are in that growing phase, that's when they're most digestible to bears. Bears aren't ruminants. They don't have multi-chambered stomachs. Their stomachs are much more similar to ours. And so they have a hard time getting energy from like mature vegetation, but that growing vegetation is really ideal for them. And seeps are a great place to find that early in the year.
Well, that's awesome. So I'm going to release mass trees. I'm going to plant better foods in my yard for birds. I'm going to make sure I take my feeders in before April 1st. And we're going to keep things messy for all wildlife in our woods. And then we are going to attend your Birds and Bears webinar next week to learn a little bit more about what specific native plants we can plant for birds if we're a bird feeder and we're worried about what our birds are going to do if we take our feeders in. Anything else off the top that I missed there?
No, that sounds great. And I'm just kind of scanning the chat, and I feel like there's some great information in there if folks aren't looking at that. Someone recommended Ben Killam's books, which he's a bear rehabilitator and researcher out of New Hampshire and has some fascinating insights into bear behavior. Someone mentioned baiting electric fencing. Yes, if you use an electric fence, putting some bait on it will make sure that it'll hit the bear in the spot where it needs to get that negative stimulus. And yeah, I just say, like, again, like you said, Lisa, messy woods, I think sometimes they make us all cringe and we have this instinct to go up there and tidy things up, but messy is actually really good for wildlife. So keep that in mind.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat box. I want to thank you so much for joining us. A recording of this will be posted to the Vermont Coverage YouTube channel. And we're really excited that you joined us today. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Jackie, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you all for attending. I just put the link to the Audubon webinar in the chat if people are interested.